Let me tell you about a lady called Margaret. Margaret was 70 years old, the sort of woman who always seemed to know what was happening before everyone else did. If there was a birthday coming up, Margaret remembered. If there was a doctor's appointment next Tuesday, Margaret remembered. If somebody forgot an anniversary, Margaret would probably be the first person to remind them. Her kitchen wall held a large calendar covered in notes and little reminders. Not because she was forgetful, because she liked things organized. For years, that system worked perfectly. Then, little by little, something started to change. The strange thing was that nobody noticed at first. Not her daughter, not her friends, not even Margaret herself, because the first signs were so small they could easily be explained away. A busy week, a poor night's sleep, a moment of distraction, the sort of thing that happens to everyone from time to time. Or so they thought. One Tuesday morning, Margaret loaded a tray of homemade scones into the back of her car. She was helping with a church coffee morning. She had done it so many times she could probably have organized it in her sleep. The drive was familiar. The route was familiar. Everything felt perfectly normal. But as she pulled into the church car park, something seemed odd. The car park was empty, completely empty. Margaret glanced at her watch, then at the church doors, then back at her watch again. She sat for a moment, wondering if she was simply early, very early. She got out of the car and walked to the notice board near the entrance. There, pinned neatly beside the church newsletter, was the date of the next coffee morning. Margaret stared at it. Then she looked again. The event wasn't that Tuesday. It was the following Tuesday. She had arrived a whole week early. For a few seconds, she simply stood there, not upset, not frightened, just confused. Eventually, she laughed, a quiet laugh to herself. "Well, Margaret," she said, "that's a new one." She climbed back into the car and drove home. By the time she reached her front door, she had almost convinced herself it was funny. When her daughter called later that evening, Margaret told the story with a smile. Her daughter laughed. Margaret laughed too, and for a while that was the end of it, or so she hoped. A few weeks later, Margaret met her friend June for lunch. They had known each other for years, the sort of friendship when neither of them needed a special reason to meet. A cup of tea, a sandwich, a bit of gossip. That was usually enough. The cafe was busy that afternoon, people chatting, cups clinking, the usual background noise. At one point, Margaret began telling June about a family holiday she had taken many years ago. It was one of her favorite stories, a seaside holiday, a small bed and breakfast, and a young boy called Michael, her son. Margaret described how Michael had spent most of the holiday trying to catch crabs in the rock pools. One afternoon he slipped straight into the water. Margaret laughed as she told it. June laughed too. She had heard this story before, but that wasn't unusual. Old friends often retell old memories. The conversation moved on, or at least June thought it had. A few minutes later, Margaret took a sip of tea. She smiled, then she said something unexpected. "Did I ever tell you about the holiday when Michael fell into a rock pool?" June paused. For a moment she thought Margaret was joking, but Margaret continued. "The same seaside town, the same bed and breakfast, the same rock pool, almost word for word." June listened quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't point it out. She simply listened. Something about it felt different. Not alarming, not dramatic, just unusual. When Margaret finished, there was a brief silence. Then the conversation carried on. as though nothing had happened. But for the rest of the afternoon, June found herself watching her friend a little more closely. Not because she was worried, because she was wondering. And sometimes wondering is where these stories begin. Margaret drove home feeling perfectly content. The lunch had been lovely. The conversation had been lovely. Everything had felt normal. And that was what made it so difficult to notice. Because from Margaret's point of view, nothing strange had happened at all. Over the next few weeks, however, she found herself doing something she had never really done before, checking things, then checking them again, and then checking them one more time. If somebody mentioned a date on the phone, Margaret would walk straight to the calendar just to make sure she had written it down correctly. If she added an appointment to her diary, she would open the diary again later that day, just to double check. At first, she hardly noticed she was doing it, but slowly it became a habit. One morning, she stood in the kitchen looking at the calendar. A dentist appointment was written clearly in blue ink. Margaret read it, then read it again. Then she walked away. A few minutes later, she came back and checked it once more, not because she had forgotten it, because lately she no longer trusted herself quite as much as she used to. That feeling was new, and she didn't like it. For most of her life, Margaret had been confident, organized, reliable, the person other people depended on. Now, every so often, a small doubt would creep into her mind, a quiet little question. Did I write that down correctly? Did I get the date right? Did somebody tell me Tuesday or Thursday? The questions were small, but they seemed to be appearing more often, and although she never mentioned it to anybody, Margaret was beginning to notice something. She was working much harder than she used to, harder to remember, harder to stay organized, harder to keep track of things that once came naturally. And for the first time in her life, that frightened her a little. One Saturday morning, Margaret's daughter stopped by for a visit. As usual, they ended up in the kitchen. Tea was made, biscuits appeared, and conversation drifted from one subject to another. At one point, Sarah glanced towards the fridge. Then she frowned. There was a yellow note stuck to the door, a second note beside it, and another one near the kettle. Buy milk. Phone dentist. Tuesday lunch with June. Sarah smiled. You've become very fond of sticky notes. Margaret laughed. I suppose I have. The conversation moved on. But later that afternoon, after Sarah had gone home, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, looking at the notes. The truth was she hadn't put them there because she liked sticky notes. She had put them there because they helped. The calendar helped. The diary helped. The notes helped. Together they made life feel manageable. Lately, Margaret had started leaving reminders in places where she couldn't miss them. Beside the kettle, on the fridge, near the front door. Not because she was forgetting everything, far from it. Most days she managed perfectly well, but the notes gave her confidence, a feeling that everything was under control, or at least mostly under control. She picked up her diary and checked next week's appointments. Then she checked them again. As she closed the diary, she found herself staring out of the kitchen window. The feeling returned. That quiet feeling she had been trying to ignore. The feeling that something was changing. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but she knew it was there, and for the first time she began to wonder whether other people might be noticing it too. A few days later, Margaret was sitting in her living room when the telephone rang. It was her grandson, Daniel. They chatted for a few minutes. School, football, the usual things. When the call ended, Margaret smiled. Daniel always brightened her day. Then she noticed something sitting on the side table, a birthday card. She picked it up. and her stomach dropped. The card was for Daniel. His birthday had been 3 days earlier. Margaret stared at the envelope. She had bought the card weeks ago. She remembered choosing it. She remembered writing it. She even remembered putting it somewhere safe so she wouldn't forget. Yet somehow she had. For a moment she simply sat there, quietly, looking at the card in her hands. Most people would probably have shrugged it off. After all, everyone forgets things occasionally. But this felt different, not because of the card, because of what it represented. Margaret had never forgotten one of her grandchildren's birthdays. Not once. Not ever. She looked around the room, as though the answer might be hiding somewhere nearby. Then she whispered something she had never said out loud before. "What is happening to me?" The room was silent. No answer came, only the ticking of the clock on the wall. And for the first time, Margaret felt genuinely afraid, not of forgetting a birthday, but of what that forgotten birthday might mean. The following Sunday, Sarah stopped by for lunch. Nothing unusual, just a quiet afternoon together. After they had eaten, Sarah began clearing the plates. As she walked through to the kitchen, she noticed Margaret sitting quietly at the table, staring into her tea. That wasn't like her. Usually, Margaret was talking about something, a neighbor, a television program, a family update, something. But today she seemed distracted. Sarah sat down opposite her. "Everything all right, Mum?" Margaret looked up quickly, almost as though she had been caught thinking. "Of course," she said. Then she smiled, the sort of smile people use when they don't really want to talk. Sarah nodded, but something told her not to let it go. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah asked again, "Genuinely, Mum, are you okay?" This time, Margaret didn't answer straight away. She looked down at her hands, then towards the calendar on the wall, then back at her tea. Finally, she sighed, a long, tired sigh. "I don't know." The word surprised even her. Sarah waited. "I just don't feel quite like myself lately." The kitchen fell silent. Margaret stared at the table, searching for the right words. "It's silly, really." "No, it isn't," Sarah said gently. Margaret nodded. Then she spoke very quietly. "I'm trying so hard to keep on top of things." Sarah listened. "I'm writing everything down. I'm checking things over and over. And sometimes—" Margaret paused. "Sometimes I still get it wrong." For the first time, Sarah saw something she hadn't noticed before. Not forgetfulness, not confusion, fear. Her mum looked frightened, and suddenly all those little things from the past few months seemed to line up. The church meeting, the sticky notes, the repeated questions, the moments Margaret had laughed off. Sarah reached across the table and took her hand. Neither woman knew exactly what was happening. Not yet, but for the first time, they were no longer pretending everything was fine. And sometimes that is where the real journey begins.